I think sometimes people have a misunderstanding thinking that we all have come in armed to prove something. And most of us who have ended up on this side came in kicking and screaming in many ways, I think. So, all right, we want to move to the Timothy passage since you've kind of opened us there. And this tends to be the one that everybody gets stuck on the most, which is interesting because Philip's going to argue tomorrow that the only text that is restrictive is actually the one we're going to talk about tomorrow, that this one can be easily knocked, this domino can also be easily knocked over. So, which is funny because it's usually the one that causes people the most problem. But not Philip. It does not cause Philip a problem. Woo! So, take us into 1 Timothy 2 and walk us through how you parse this.
Okay. The first full paragraph of 1 Timothy and the content of both 1st and 2nd Timothy show that Paul is writing to Timothy to give him advice on how to deal with false teaching. 1 Timothy 1:20 mentions Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom Paul had handed over to Satan to be taught not to blaspheme. Interesting, Paul then says, I was a blasphemer, but Christ had mercy on me. Now, the rest of 1 Timothy deals specifically with women who were spreading false teaching out of ignorance, like Paul had out of ignorance. We know this because of the close parallels between Paul's description of the false teachers and these women. And I've already mentioned a few of them, but 2 Timothy picks up on this about gullible women who are loaded down with sins and are swayed by all kinds of evil desires, always learning but never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. One important background to this, to understanding 1 Timothy and Paul's response to the problem is Priscilla and her presence in Ephesus. Acts 18 says that they arrived in Ephesus where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. And Paul greets Priscilla and Aquila in 2 Timothy 4:19 in Ephesus. Remember back in Acts 18:26, quote, when Priscilla and Aquila heard Apollos, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more accurately. Note that Priscilla's name is listed before Aquila's, contrary to normal Greek convention. So it's reasonable to suppose that she did most of the teaching. And by the way, both by Luke in Acts and Paul, when they first introduced the couple, both of them begin saying Aquila and Priscilla. When they're first introduced, both of them list Aquila first. But when they talk about ministry in the church, they always put Priscilla first. My point is, because you have a problem with women who were deceived in Ephesus, and because Priscilla is in Ephesus, and she's a teacher who even taught Apollos, who was deeply trained in the scriptures, she is probably his best resource to deal with this false teaching issue. So it's unlikely that the solution he gives would silence her. The only imperative in this section in 1 Timothy is verse 11. A woman must learn in quietness and full submission. The word for quietness conveys calm. The word for silence in 1 Corinthians 14:34 and 35 is different. Since they should quietly respond to the teaching, it's natural to understand the submission as to the to be to the teaching as well. So not submission to a male leader, but submission to the teaching.
So why doesn't Paul tell the men to do likewise? I mean,
the reason Paul didn't tell the men to do that is because the problem was with the women. you address the problem. There's no reference to men currently deceiving or teaching the false teaching in Ephesus, but there are plenty of references to the women doing it. So he mentions the women because they are the problem. And furthermore,
That'll tweet. The women are the problem. That too will be a tweet.
In Ephesus.
In Ephesus back then, back then.
Now, the other thing is, he says, why does he say, let women learn? Well, there was already a culture of men learning. There was no culture of women learning. There's been a study of all the lists of students in Ephesus found in papyri. There's not a single female name. They're all males. So there is no pattern. So when Paul says, let the women learn, this is revolutionary.
Big.
It's big. Excellent question. The next sentence is our key passage, and the one normally used to bar women from teaching. It should be translated, I am not permitting a woman to assume authority to teach a man if she does not already have that authority. She must be calm. There are 4 key issues to understanding this passage. First, the verb, I am not permitting, indicates something that is presently ongoing. It does not imply a permanent or a universal command like I do not permit. I am not permitting is the proper translation. Second, the word permit is never used in the original text of Scripture as a universal command, but instead for temporary permission for a specific situation. Third, the word to assume authority occurs nowhere else in the Bible. It combines the word meaning by oneself, of one's own initiative, and the word meaning who finishes, achieves. It stresses the activity of the self, as in accomplish for one's own advantage. It has a common nuance like autocrat, acting unilaterally. Related words usually convey a negative nuance. Its most common meaning in Paul's day was to assume authority that one does not rightfully have. And fourth, the 2 verbs here, to teach and to assume authority, are joined by the coordinating conjunction Paul typically uses to combine 2 elements to convey a single idea. Only one thing is being prohibited, and that is to assume authority to teach. Now, let's put all 4 of those together. In the currently ongoing crisis of false teaching, Paul is not permitting women in the church in Ephesus to assume authority to teach if they do not rightfully have that authority. Women like Priscilla, who had recognized authority to teach, would not be assuming authority because they already had recognized teaching authority.
Okay, so wait a minute. So why would Paul specifically limit women from assuming authority to teach men?
Yeah, why, as people have said, why would he limit women assuming authority to teach a man? A man. Paul does not explain his reason, but this makes sense in that culture because, as a man, Timothy would not have been permitted access to women's private discussions. There would have been no culturally acceptable way for Timothy to monitor what women were teaching other women. Prohibiting a woman specifically from assuming authority to teach a man, however, is what would happen typically in the gatherings of the Christian church. attended by both men and women. And Paul's specification, a man, made this a limited rule that Timothy could enforce without offending cultural standards of privacy and propriety. Paul then goes on to justify his restriction. And by the way, let's imagine you're one of those women in Ephesus who's pushing the false teaching. And Timothy says, some people have said, Paul should have just said, don't permit false teaching. Well, if you're that false teacher, and Timothy says, Paul said you shouldn't teach false teaching, well, what would you say? So, I'm not teaching false teaching. This is true. I wouldn't teach it if I didn't think it was true. But that wouldn't work as to stop it. But if Timothy says, Paul said, you can't assume authority for yourself to teach. Well, they were assuming authority for themselves. They were teaching in public where the men are. I mean, it's a very clear thing that he can enforce. So then he gives the reason. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. The first reason parallels Paul's three statements in 1 Corinthians 11. Like there, Paul's point is that woman should respect man as her source. Women seizing authority to teach disrespected men. You've maybe been in a church service where in the midst of the sermon, someone gets up and starts speaking. Well, that's disrespectful. And it was disrespectful for women to, in a little house church, that's what she's doing. The second reason is the key reason, for it highlights how serious the consequences are when a deceived woman teaches a man. And how much more serious can you have than the fall of humanity through the deception of Eve? And unless Adam heard something that Genesis does not mention him hearing, his eating of the forbidden fruit does not even rise to the level of deception. It's flat out disobedience. Women in Ephesus were deceived, just as the first woman had been in the garden. Paul's solution is clear. He wants the women to learn and to learn well. Then they can become solid leaders, not prone to deception. Paul concludes the passage in verse 15. And I'm going to give a translation that I think conveys the meaning. But anyone will be saved through the birth of Christ if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. Neither will be saved, nor if they continue is feminine. Many of your translations say she will be saved, but those verbs are not feminine, nor is there a feminine subject in that sentence. Furthermore, we have a shift from anyone will be saved if they, so from singular to plural. And the only subject that naturally fits both the singular and the plural is anyone, because it is singular, but it refers to a plurality of persons. Everything in this sentence applies perfectly to all believers. In surviving Greek literature prior to Paul, the word used here, childbirth, always refers to the birth of a child, never the process of childbearing. Furthermore, the article the precedes childbirth, the childbirth. There are 61 cases in 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus where there's an article. Only one of them is clearly generic. The translation, she'll be saved through childbearing, is a generic interpretation of the article. But of the 61 cases, there's only one clear case in the pastorals where that happens. 55 cases are clearly individualizing, speaking about a specific person or event. So it's most natural to understand this as a reference to one particular childbirth. Through which childbirth is anyone saved? Presumably, the only child ever born who can save anyone, Jesus. Indeed, Paul had just written in chapter 1:15, Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners. Came into the world. That's the childbirth. And shortly thereafter, in 3:16, he says, he appeared in the flesh. And remember, he's writing to Timothy, his emissary. Timothy knows Paul's theology. He knows Paul's theology of the seed. He knows Paul's, all that stuff. So for him, that's not that hard to understand. Every other instance of the word to save in Paul's letters concerns spiritual salvation. Furthermore, this perfectly fits the conditions that follow. If they continue in faith, well, faith, that's necessary for salvation. Love, it's the heart of the gospel. And holiness, without holiness, who can be saved? This is then an encouraging and empowering message for women, because it says it's the seed of the woman. He's just been quoting the passage, and the passage goes right on to speak of the seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head. That's what salvation comes. It's the proto-evangelion, the earliest statement of the gospel. The next chapter, 1 Timothy 3, starts, whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a good work. Paul uses the Greek word for anyone, male and female. You remember, Paul had just been talking about men and women. If he had intended to restrict overseers to men, he would have said something like, any man who desires the office of overseer desires a good work. But Paul does not say man or he. Paul says whoever, because Paul means whoever, any man or woman. There are two recent versions of translations, the Contemporary English Version and Common English Bible, that accurately reflect the Greek of these requirements for overseer by having no he, him, or his in the requirements here or in Titus chapter 1. But most translations have a ton of them. The ESV adds he, him, or his 14 times when it's not in the Greek.
That makes it sound like it's male.
It does.
Right.
Yeah, he, the overseer, he must be, his children must be, him, he, his, him, 14 times.
Can you tell him why that was? Because this was something you taught me a while ago, and I was like, I had learned that somewhere and forgotten it. Why did they put the he in there?
I don't know for every particular person, but I think the typical thing is, well, we already know that Paul never permits women to teach or have authority over a man, so of course women couldn't be an overseer. Therefore, we're justified in putting all these in there. The ESV introduction says, we always represent the text to the Greek as closely as we can, not adding things that are not there. Well, here they added 14 masculine pronouns where there are none in the Greek. The subject is anyone, and some translations say any man. They change anyone to any man. I mean, that's the NIV, by the way, adds 17 masculine pronouns in these two passages. The word for the overseer in verse 2 is a masculine noun. But the word for the office of overseer in verse 1 is a feminine noun. Neither implies that overseers must be women or men. It's simply Greek convention that when the groups of people are addressed, you use the masculine form of the noun. Tim Freiberg, himself a complementarian, and he was the author of the Analytical Greek Testament, which gives the grammatical form of each word in the New Testament. He counted between 7,500 and 8,000 instances in the New Testament, almost one per sentence, where a masculine form either must or could apply to women. Accordingly,
Hold on. I think they need you to say that again.
okay, the New Testament has between 7,500 and 8,000 masculine forms that either must apply to women or could apply to women. And that's accounting by a complementarian.
So when it says he, it actually means he and she.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
exactly. When you refer to a group of people in Greek, you use the masculine form. That's the way they did it. So, the presence of one or more masculine nouns or adjectives should not be used to exclude women from this text or any other text of the New Testament about a group of people. This leaves us with only one expression in this paragraph that has been used to exclude women from the office of overseer, and that is man of one woman. It's typically translated faithful to his wife. The closest English equivalent is monogamous, which can refer either to a man or a woman. Note that none of the three words, man of one woman, means faithful. It's the combination of the three together that means faithful person. Those three words are a figure of speech, an idiom that acts like a noun, and like many Greek nouns, comes in both feminine and masculine forms. By Greek convention, when both men and women are being described, the masculine form is the one that is used, as here. Paul does use the feminine form in chapter 5, woman of one man, when describing which widows should receive financial assistance. She must have been faithful to her husband. Paul here uses the feminine form because widows, by definition, are exclusively female. But it was conventional when referring to a group of people who might be either men or women to use the masculine form of the idiom. Therefore, although the idiomatic phrase man of one woman includes men as potential overseers, it does not exclude women. By the way, both Tom Schreiner and Doug Moo, prominent complementarian scholars, acknowledge that man of one woman does not exclude women. The eloquent Greek church father, John Chrysostom, who knew Hellenistic Greek better than anyone alive today, confirms this. Even though he opposed women in leadership, he wrote regarding men of one woman in 1 Timothy 3:12, quote, deacons must be men of one woman. This is appropriate to say regarding women deacons also. So here's someone who himself was opposed to women in leadership. But in reading Paul, he understood the idiom man of one woman does not exclude women. In summary, Paul starts out this paragraph with his thesis statement that anybody who wants to become an overseer desires a good work. This encourages women to desire becoming an overseer, and nothing in this paragraph overrules that. None of the qualifications exclude women. Regarding deacon qualification, Paul begins both verse 8 and verse 11 in the same way to cause readers to add the implied verb from verse 2, it is necessary for deacons to be. verse 8 identifies 4 requirements. Deacons are to be worthy of respect, sincere, not indulging in much wine, and not pursuing dishonest gain. In verse 11, Paul repeats virtually the same 4 qualifications in the same order for women deacons. In the same way, it is necessary for women deacons to be worthy of respect, not malicious talkers, but temperate and trustworthy in everything. This shows that both verses list requirements for a church office. And because verse 8 has identified the office of deacon, and because the very next verse is also about the office of deacon, it's clear then that these are requirements for the office of deacon. In verse 12, Paul continues the qualifications for deacons, saying, quote, "A deacon must be faithful to his wife." The specific reference to women deacons in verse 11 makes it clear that men of one woman in verse 12 does not exclude women. John Chrysostom confirms this. Men of one woman is appropriate to say regarding women deacons also.
All right, we have more, but time is ticking and Chris is watching the clock. So I want to give you a few minutes to ask questions about 1 Timothy or 1 Timothy 2 or 3, because this is the bomb. Well, you think it's the bomb, actually. Tomorrow's the bomb. But so who would like to ask a little bit about this passage, this tricky passage?
I don't consider myself particularly ambitious, so I'm not trying to become a preacher, but I find myself earning de facto authority when women ask me, what would you do? Or what's your advice or your education? You seem to know the Bible really well. So what would you say or counsel a woman to do when she's finding authority opportunities and she really doesn't want to assume authority or usurp authority? When can you teach and when can you not?
I'm not sure I understood the question. So but I would say that if you're being asked to take a position of authority, you are not assuming it for yourself. See, what is being prohibited is the assumption of authority that one does not rightfully have. When I was in Japan as a missionary, I talked to many women missionaries who told me how they were asked by Japanese pastors to preach and do things that they would never do at home. And many of them were conflicted. They were being asked to do it, but they had grown up in a culture that said women can't do that. And their translations didn't say assume authority. They just said to assume authority or to teach. They just had to have authority. And so assuming it seemed like inappropriate.
Does deacon mean the same thing that we would use for elders today? Because it seems like there's a separation of an elder as a leader, but a deacon can take care of people or serve communion, but elders are the ones who rule, therefore men. So is there a difference in this between deacons and elders?
I just want to say before he answers it, I was chuckling. You said that the deacons serve and, give out whatever. And I'm thinking, well, that sounded a lot like Jesus. Yeah. I guess he was a deacon. Sorry.
Well, the word deacon comes from the Greek word that means to serve. And in the New Testament, it's used and it's translated in 3 different ways. Sometimes it's translated servant, sometimes it's translated deacon, and sometimes it's translated minister. And the office, as it is described of Phoebe in Romans 16, where she's called diakonon, of the church of in Cenchrea, which is a port city of Corinth. Then they are told, whatever she asks of you, do it. And 4, she has been a prostatis of many, including myself also. Now, prostatis was the title of the president of the synagogue or the president of an association. So and Paul says that she has been a prostatis of many, including myself also. That means when he was in her church, he put himself under her leadership. So the way that she's described there as deacon of the church of Cenchrea is much more like what we would call a minister today. So it depends on the passage, how you best describe it. But those are the 3 options you need to look. The word deacon means different things in different churches today. In some churches, the deacons are the elders. In other churches, the deacons, they have no authority whatsoever. They just do things to help people.
And I would say if you actually looked at the early church before it was fully established or started getting organized, post or pre-Constantine, we don't see as much structure as we see later. So what we're seeing is a progressive development, right? It's not like, I want to be really careful when we start talking about church structures, elders, deacons, blah, blah. I mean, look around. Nobody's church has the exact same structure. Why is that? I would even argue in the early churches, we didn't see that either. That actually got very developed underneath Constantine when he wanted it organized. We started taking on a lot of authority or hierarchy from that. And so it gets more and more developed. So I just want to say that in and of itself is not thus says the Lord, like the only way it can be done. Otherwise, the early church for 300 years was doing it wrong.
Yeah, good.
I have a question. Considering the addition of, you said 14 and 17, he, him, verbs or whatever, in the ESV and the NIV, right? It seems intentionally misleading in a way, like that the translators were trying to convey the idea that it was meant towards men. And do you think that's like imperfect? Would you agree with that? And do you think we need a new translation of the Bible that's more true to the original Greek?
Well, if you read the ESV Study Bible, then you realize that the ESV editors are committed to male hierarchy of authority. And so that fits their bias, and so it's a natural way to do that. Whether the particular committee members were conscious of that, I don't know. In terms of the general tendency of the NIV compared to the ESV, I can give you one example. They were both revised in 2011 to the new version. And the chairman of the committees of New Testament revision both invited me to make comment. And I sent the same data to both groups. And in that data, I identified these are all the occurrences of the verb authentein. And the first occurrence where it means to exercise authority is circa 370 AD. And to have authority is even later. During the time of Paul, I documented the meaning to assume authority that one does not rightfully have. The chairman of both committees were complementarians. Doug Moo was the chairman of the ESV. And we've actually been in debate with each other over the years. And interestingly, in the debate, he started out with an article where he said, quote, "Women by their created nature are incapable of teaching." And I called him on the carpet And in his response, he said, Payne is right. I was wrong. I shouldn't have said that. So, I mean, there's some flexibility here. Doug Moo sent my study to every member of the New Testament Revision Committee. They voted on it. He phoned me the same day they voted, said, Phil, you'll be interested to know that the committee has voted to adopt the translation, assume authority. And I was very grateful. So here's the complementarian who was sufficiently open to the truth that he was willing to share that data with people who had the authority to change the text. I emailed the chairman of the ESV Revision Committee and said, what did the ESV committee decide about the translation of this verb? And he wrote back and said, I never gave them your paper. And I said, why not? He said, I didn't think it was that important. And I said, this affects over half the church and whether they can take leadership of the church. How can it not be that important when every complementarian leader says this is the crucial passage? On the basis of my experience and on the basis of the content of the ESV Study Bible, I believe there's a deliberate bias that excludes data that doesn't support that viewpoint.
And so one of the things we have to acknowledge is that knowledge and power are intrinsically tied. And that we do have, and this is, I'm probably going to, Philip would say it so much nicer than I would, but I think we have to acknowledge that we have gatekeepers who care, on both sides, by the way. It isn't just one, it doesn't lean one way. But this is why when I graduated from seminary and I realized I have a degree and I did not hear this other side of the story that underneath the same umbrella of the same strain of Christianity, right? That's gatekeeping of knowledge. And so we have to find means to go around the gatekeepers, if you will, to get the full knowledge. And what I hope happens here tonight is that you hear this. I'm sure you've already heard the other side. If you haven't, you better hear it. You should hear all of it. You should do the scope. You should do your work. And then ask the Spirit, where do I sit with this? Where do you want me to move with this, right? Like, where would you like me to be now? So, but we got to come up with ways to come around the gatekeepers, because whether you like to hear that or not, they do exist on all levels. Any other questions before we close it out? One back here. And by the way, if you have to head out, we are not going to be offended. I learned a long time ago when I taught in Rwanda.
Hold the mic up close to the mouth.
Yeah. So go.
Okay, thanks. I have some technical questions, but I think I'm just going to stick with something a little bit more for all three of you. All three of you kind of came into this later on in life. I think it was before you, Dr. Phil.
I know it's hard to
It's awkward. Yeah.
Thank you.
Before I think you got married, but I'm curious. I know this is a theological thing, but how did this shift things in your marriage?
Well, for me, it didn't shift them at all. My husband was always pushing me places I did not want to go. To be honest with you, I went to go get my doctorate, and at the same time, the same week I was going, I was with 26 senior pastors and me, the only female in the class, and my son got kicked out of school. And I was like, I'm not going. I was a mess. What mother leaves home when her child has no school to go to on Monday, you know? And my husband, who's also a New Yorker, so he said, no, blankety blank, you will get on that plane. You will go get your doctorate. You're not going to let that child or anybody else get in the way of what God has for you. And so my husband was always, it didn't cause tension because he was always a massive proponent of women and pushed me before I even wanted to go.
Now, I'm not sure if I understood the question properly, but one thing I did hear that resonated was the question, how does this work out practically? And how significant is it? Let me give you an illustration. I love my father, He's the greatest dad any kid has ever had, and I mean that. Fun-loving, great adventures, all kinds of stuff, brilliant discussions. I love my dad. I'd rather be with my dad than almost anybody else talking about almost any topic. When Dad came to Japan, and my wife and I are missionaries in Japan, and Dad was giving lectures in seminaries, Dad was keen to go and climb Mount Fuji. He'd climb Mount Olympus and all kinds of other mountains, and he wanted to climb Mount Fuji. But the day he wanted to go was miserable. It was raining and windy and blustery. And Mom said, "Barton, please don't go. It's just too dangerous." And I said, "Dad, you're crazy to go. Don't go." And Nancy said, "Please don't go." But his response was, "I really want to go. And I don't know if he used these words, but as head of the house, I have the right to do what I want to do. And so I'm going. It's my only chance. And I won't cause any trouble. I'll see you down in Kyoto." Well, the day he was supposed to come back, he didn't come. And the next day he didn't come. And none of the professors he'd been teaching with had heard from him. And so scores of us went to Mount Fuji to search for his body. And the lead hiker got a cramp way up on the mountain, so they couldn't go farther up. And so the other members spread out. And they found his body at that level. And I went up the next day and helped carry down Dad's body. If he had submitted to his wife, he would not have died there. And we would not have lost a great dad. If he had followed 1 Corinthians 11's statement, the husband's body, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but his wife does, he would not have gone. It has huge implications for how we live.
Thank you for sharing that. It's a beautiful story. I love that. He was young, 56,
56 years old.
and a brilliant professor in Hebrew.
When we had devotions, every day we'd read around a verse by verse, and every day on every verse, through many times through the scriptures, he would translate directly from the Hebrew and the Greek. And I never heard him stumble on one word of any passage of scripture any time. He knew it that well. We lost a huge
Great loss.
And there's so many times that I wished I could say, "Dad, what do you think about this?" And we need each other. We need each other in marriage, and we need the wisdom that the other partner brings.